Winter of 1891 settled hard over the Dakota Territory. Snow did not fall gently here. It came like a burden, heavy and determined, burying everything beneath silence. The plains stretched outward, empty and endless, broken only by barren trees clawing at the sky and the thin thread of a frozen creek that once promised life. The world felt forgotten by time, abandoned by God, left to shiver in its own loneliness. Elias Crow stood on the porch of his small wooden cabin, staring out over the white land that had long stopped feeling like home. The wind cut deep, creeping through the seams of his coat, but he did not move. Cold had become a familiar companion. It bit, but it did not judge. It did not pity him the way other men had when they still bothered to look his way. 3 years, 3 long years of silence had passed since the sound of laughter last lived inside these walls. 3 winters had come and gone since he had buried his wife in the small hillside beyond the pine trees. 3 springs had bloomed without her standing in the doorway, smiling as if the world still held meaning. And perhaps the cruelest truth of all, it still did. He just no longer belonged in it. Inside the cabin, a small fire burned low, the scent of old wood and smoke wrapped around the room like a ghost refusing to leave. A tin cup lay on the table, its rim stained dark from months of neglect. A photograph lay face down beside it, edges worn from fingers that had once struggled to let go. He never turned it over anymore. He did not need the reminder. The memories lived deeper than any image ever could. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Then came another sound, soft, uneasy. A knock. Elias didn't move. For a moment he thought the cold was playing tricks on him. The plains had a way of whispering to lonely men, tricking them with echoes of forgotten lives. He remained still, his breath curling into the air in thin clouds, eyes fixed on the endless white beyond. Another knock came, weaker this time, followed by something else. A sound so small it nearly disappeared into the wind. A cough, too light to be a man's, too fragile. Elias closed his eyes. He didn't want this moment to be real. Whoever stood at his door was not supposed to exist here. Nobody came this far out in winter. Nobody survived the journey alone. The knock came again, barely more than a desperate tap against dying wood. "Please," a voice whispered, cracked and trembling. "We just need warmth for one night." A woman's voice, and beneath it, the faint sound of shivering. Children. His jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to stay where he was, to let the storm decide their fate, to remain wrapped in his grief where pain was familiar and predictable. But another part of him, the part that had once been a husband, the part that had once dreamed of being a father, that part rose slowly from wherever it had been buried. He stepped forward, his hand wrapped around the cold iron latch of the door. For a moment he held it. The weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future balanced on that one breath. Then he pulled it open. The night air rushed inside, but his eyes were captured by the sight in front of him. A woman stood there in the blowing snow, wrapped in thin, worn cloth that barely counted as protection. Her dark hair clung to her face, dusted with frost as if winter itself had claimed her. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin pale from hunger and exhaustion. But her posture carried a quiet strength that refused to bow to despair. Clinging to her were 2 children. A boy, maybe 10 years old, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist, trying to be strong, trying not to tremble, and a little girl no more than 6, her lips tinged with blue, eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. They did not look like strangers. They looked like something the world had tried and failed to erase. "We didn't mean to disturb you," the woman said again, her voice almost lost to the wind. "The town turned us away. The farms too. They said there is no room, no mercy for our kind." Her words hung in the frozen air. Elias looked at the little girl. Her knees buckled slightly, just a small give of weakness before she steadied again. The boy tightened his grip around her. Something sharp twisted in Elias's chest. He stepped aside. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Now, before the storm worsens." The woman hesitated, not used to kindness that came without a price. Her eyes searched his face for cruelty but found none. Only a deep, tired sorrow that looked a lot like her own. She nodded once, guided the children into the cabin, stepped inside last. Elias closed the door behind them, sealed out the storm, sealed out the world. The silence inside felt different now. Not empty, not haunted, changed by the presence of living breath. He moved quickly, added wood to the fire. Flames rose up, pushing the cold back. He fetched old blankets from his bed, wrapping them carefully around the children's frail shoulders. Their bodies trembled, but slowly, gradually, warmth began to reach them. The woman watched him closely. Every movement, every choice, like someone waiting for the kindness to shift into something darker. But it didn't. "You're safe here," he said simply. The word tasted foreign on his tongue. Safe. He had not spoken that word in years. He poured what little water he had into a small pot and set it above the flame. Found dried beans, a crust of bread. Not much, but enough to mean life tonight. The children stared at the food like it might disappear. "They won't touch it without permission," she said softly. "They don't need permission here," Elias replied. She nodded to them gently. They began to eat slowly at first, then with the quiet desperation of hunger long denied. Elias stepped back, watching without staring. He felt like an intruder in his own home, as if their presence had turned the space into something sacred he was not worthy to stand inside. "What are your names?" he asked quietly. "Daniel," the boy answered, his voice small but steady. "And this is my sister, Lila." The girl looked up at him, her eyes too old for her tiny face. She managed the faintest smile. "And you?" Elias asked the woman. "Maribel," she said. "We came from the south." There was nothing left there after the fires and the men with guns. Just dust and bodies. Elias didn't ask more. Pain had already spoken. He nodded once. "Elias." The name felt strange, spoken aloud to people who might live long enough to remember it. Outside the storm howled stronger. Inside the fire glowed warmer. That night, after the children had fallen asleep curled near the hearth, Maribel sat across from him, the space between them heavy with unspoken pasts. "You lost someone," she said. He didn't look up. "Everyone does. But yours lives in this room," she answered gently. "You can feel it." He finally glanced toward the table, toward the photograph still face down. "Yes," he said. "She does." Silence returned, but it was no longer hollow. It was shared. A strange kind of peace settled inside that small, forgotten cabin. Neither of them noticed. But the storm outside had begun to fade, and something else, buried deep beneath years of grief, had just begun to breathe again. Morning came slow and gray, as though the sun itself was unsure whether the world was worth rising for anymore. A pale light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting thin, fragile lines across the wooden floor. The fire had burned low, reduced to quiet embers, a dull orange glow barely clinging to life. Elias had not slept. He sat in his chair, wrapped in his coat, staring into the fading warmth, listening to the small sounds of breathing on the floor near the hearth, soft, uneven, alive. For 3 years, mornings had arrived in silence. No movement, no whispers, no small feet padding over worn boards. Now, there was the slow rhythm of existence in his home again, and it unsettled him more than the loneliness ever had. Behind him the blankets shifted. Maribel stirred first. She sat up, careful not to wake the children. For a moment she simply watched them, her expression softening into something that had nothing to do with fear. "You should have woken me," she said quietly. "You needed sleep more than I did," Elias replied. He stood and stirred the embers to life, feeding the flame until it caught again. The room warmed little by little. She knelt by the children and gently brushed frost from Daniel's dark hair. Lila's fingers were curled tightly into the blanket, as if even in her dreams she was afraid of losing warmth. "How long since they've eaten a full meal?" he asked. 3 days. "Maybe more," Maribel answered. "Out there, time feels like a lie." He nodded, understanding too well how time could stretch into something unbearable. He searched through the small shelves lining his wall, finding the last of his dried potatoes, some salted meat buried in a cloth, a tin of oats he had been saving for when the snows grew thickest. Without a word, he placed it all on the table. "That would last you a week," she said softly. "I don't count days anymore." Her eyes lifted to him at that. Something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to be a soul still breathing, but not living. She busied herself at the small stove, moving as carefully as if she had done this all her life. Her hands were gentle but capable. Soon the scent of warm broth and cooked grain began to fill the cabin. A scent that once belonged to another woman's hands. A scent he had chased through memory only to be swallowed by grief. Daniel woke first. He sat up suddenly, looking around in confusion as if unsure whether the warmth was real. "Are we still here?" he asked. "You are," Maribel said. "But only as long as you mind your manners." Daniel nodded quickly, his eyes shifting toward Elias. "Thank you for not letting us freeze." "Sir," he said, his voice low but sincere, "I won't touch anything without asking." "You don't need to ask for food or warmth in this house," Elias answered. "Those are things every person deserves, even when the world forgets it." Lila stirred, blinking into the pale light. When she realized where she was, her expression softened instead of tightening with fear. "It's warm," she whispered. Then for the first time she smiled. Something in that smile clawed its way into the cracks of Elias's heart. They ate together in silence. Not the kind that weighed heavy, but the kind that exists when trust is still learning how to breathe. After the meal, Daniel wandered toward the far corner of the cabin where an old workbench stood. Dust-covered tools lay abandoned from another life. "You make things?" the boy asked, running his fingers lightly over the handle of a chisel. "Not anymore. But you used to." It was a statement, not a question. Elias walked over, lifting an unfinished wooden figure he'd left behind years ago. A half-carved horse. The curves rough. The shape still trapped inside the wood. "I used to make toys for my son," he said quietly. Daniel studied the block of wood with careful curiosity. "Can you show me?" Every part of him wanted to refuse. Wanted to close that door the same way he had closed every other since loss had taken over his world. But the boy's eyes carried something that looked too much like hope. "Sit," he said at last. Daniel climbed onto the stool. Elias placed a small piece of pine in his hands. "Hold it steady. Like this." Their fingers brushed briefly. A simple, innocent touch. But it carried the weight of memory and missed years. Lila came over too, watching in wide-eyed fascination as the knife moved slowly across the grain. "What are you making?" she asked. "A bird," Daniel answered proudly. "But it doesn't have wings yet." "Then we'll give them to it." Maribel watched from the table, her hands folded as if in prayer. A faint emotion glistened in her eyes. Not fear, not sadness. Gratitude, and something else. Recognition. Hours passed faster than any Elias had known in years. The storm outside began to loosen its grip. Snowfall faded into a distant memory, leaving behind a quiet, frozen world that finally looked survivable. As the sun dipped behind the pale horizon, Daniel held up his finished carving. A crooked little bird, uneven and imperfect, but alive with effort. "Is it any good?" he asked. Elias studied it carefully. "It's the best bird I've seen in a very long time." The boy beamed. That night they sat close to the fire. Elias spoke of the land, of distant rivers and wild horses he had once ridden beside. The children listened as though he were speaking of something magical, something unreachable. Lila fell asleep against his leg without realizing it. He didn't move. He didn't want to disturb that moment. Maribel wrapped her in another blanket. Their hands touched for a brief second in the quiet. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "when the road's clear, we'll continue on." His heart twisted. "To where?" he asked. "I heard work can be found west, beyond the mountains. Somewhere that doesn't know our faces yet." "That's a long way through unforgiving land." "So was this." Silence settled between them again. But this time it was filled with fear of what awaited beyond this door, and something dangerously close to regret for what might be left behind. He turned to the window, looking out at the endless white. "You're safer here for now," he said finally. "At least until the roads are certain." "For how long?" He did not answer that question, because somewhere inside him, for the first time in 3 years, he was afraid of being alone again. And out there in the distance, unseen but surely approaching, Red River Town was already beginning to talk. The road into Red River Town cut through a long stretch of barren land, a pale scar across the frozen earth. Elias rode it late that afternoon, snow crunching beneath his horse's hooves, the horizon painted in shades of dying sunlight. He kept his head low beneath his hat, hoping distance and habit might still make him invisible. But small towns remember, And small towns watch. The general store bell chimed as he entered. Warmth and the scent of flour and leather wrapped around him. Samuel Griggs stood behind the counter, eyebrows lifting in mild surprise. "Well, if it isn't Elias Crow," he said, forcing a half-smile. "Didn't expect to see you in town again before winter breaks." "I needed supplies," Elias replied, moving down the aisles with purpose. He gathered flour, sugar, dried beans, coffee, more than one man usually needed. Samuel noticed. "You stocking up for a long winter?" he asked. "Or you finally got tired of talking to the walls out there?" Elias didn't answer. A few men in the back glanced at him, whispered, stopped, whispering when he looked their way. Outside, another horse snorted. The front door creaked open slowly. Sheriff Dalton entered. His boots echoed heavy against the wooden floor, the weight of authority following him like a shadow. His eyes found Elias almost immediately. "Afternoon, Crow," he said. "Heard your cabin's been looking livelier than usual." The air shifted. The store fell quiet. "Is that a problem, Sheriff?" Elias asked evenly. "Depends on who's making it lively," Dalton replied, stepping closer. Samuel busied himself with a sack of grain, pretending he didn't hear a word. "Tommy Jenkins rode past your land 2 nights ago," Dalton continued. "Said he saw smoke thicker than usual. Said he saw footprints, too. Small ones." Elias picked up a tin of coffee. His hand didn't shake. "Snow shows all kinds of things if you stare at it long enough." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "People around here don't care much for strangers," he said quietly. "Especially the ones who ain't exactly from around here." "I'm a stranger too," Elias replied, looking him dead in the eye. "Aren't I? That's different. You bought your land, buried your dead. You earned your quiet. Those people you brought in? They haven't earned anything here. They earned their right to breathe." Sheriff Dalton leaned in closer, his voice low, dangerous. "You always this fond of causes, Crow? Or just fond of a certain pretty stranger?" A cold anger stirred in Elias's gut. "They are under my roof," he said. "That's all you need to know." "For now," Dalton answered. "Town will be having words, though. And when a town starts talking, silence don't last long." Outside, wind whipped against the walls of the store. "You got until morning," the sheriff continued. "Either they're gone, or we start asking harder questions." He turned and walked out without another word. The bell chimed again. Silence filled the space he left behind. Samuel finally looked up. "You in some kind of trouble, Elias?" Elias tightened the straps on his supplies. "Depends on what side of mercy people decide to stand." By the time he returned to the cabin, darkness had crept across the plains. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, thin and steady, warm, alive, a sight that now felt like something he could lose. Maribel stood in the doorway as he approached. She did not smile. "They know," she said. "Yes. How long do we have?" "Until morning, if that." Daniel and Lila hovered behind her, sensing something was wrong even if they didn't understand what. "We need to leave tonight," Maribel whispered. "We cannot be the reason you lose what little standing you still have here." He stepped down from the horse and looked around the land. His land, his solitude, his prison. "I already lost everything that mattered," he said. "What's left has only just begun to breathe again." "You don't owe us your future," she said, gripping his arm. "We were never meant to stay. You don't get to decide that alone." Her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "And what about the children?" she hissed. "Do you think they will spare them if their anger grows teeth?" He crouched down before Daniel. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked gently. "No, sir." "Are you afraid of staying here?" Daniel looked at Lila, then back at him. "I'm afraid of the men in town." "So am I," Elias admitted. "But I am more afraid of becoming the kind of man who leaves children in the cold just to be accepted by people, who forgot what kindness means." Silence. "Pack nothing," he said quietly. "If they come, they'll find us exactly where we stand." That night no one slept. Elias sat by the door, rifle resting against the wall untouched. Maribel knelt in silent prayer. Daniel kept his arm wrapped around Lila, his own body trying to shield hers like a grown man might do. Before dawn, the sound arrived. Hooves. More than one. Slow. Deliberate. Elias rose to his feet. He opened the door before they could knock. Sheriff Dalton led 4 men up the path, faces hard, breath visible in the freezing air. "Well, Crow," he said, "you decided yet?" Elias stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked beneath his boots. "Yes, Sheriff. I decided the moment I let them in." "And what did you decide?" "That no decent man lets a woman and children die on his doorstep, just to remain in good standing with cowards." The men murmured behind Dalton. Hands hovered near belts and rifles. "And you're willing to lose everything for that?" the sheriff asked. Elias thought of the first night. The whisper, the trembling hands, the warmth that returned to his cabin. "I already lost everything once," he said. "Now I finally know what it's like to have something worth standing for." Dalton studied his face. Then slowly, almost sadly, he said, "Then tomorrow, the town decides what to do with you." He turned his horse. "But understand this, Crow. When a man chooses the outcasts, he becomes one too." The horses turned and vanished into the gray morning fog. Maribel stepped onto the porch beside him. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. Elias stared toward the invisible town. "Tomorrow," he said, "I remind them what it means to be human." And for the first time he felt no fear at all. Dawn broke over the Dakota plains with a pale, uncertain light, the kind that did not promise warmth, only visibility. Frost clung to the bare branches like forgotten prayers. The earth remained still, as if holding its breath for what was about to happen. Inside the cabin, no one spoke. Daniel fastened the buttons of his old coat with trembling fingers. Lila stood beside Maribel, silently holding her hand. Elias watched them, his jaw set, his thoughts steady. Strange how clarity arrived on the edge of ruin. They were not running. They were walking into the open. Elias hitched the wagon and helped them climb in. There were no possessions worth taking, no memories worth dragging behind them. Only the present, only the living. As the wheels creaked forward, the town of Red River came into view. Wooden buildings lined the road. Frozen mud hardened into rutted paths. Curtains twitched in windows as faces pressed close behind the glass. Word had traveled faster than any storm. By the time they reached the old church at the end of the main road, a crowd had already gathered. Men with folded arms, women with worried eyes, children holding tight to their parents' hands. And at the center of it all, Sheriff Dalton stood on the steps. "You sure about this, Crow?" he called. "Last chance to turn that wagon around." Elias helped Maribel and the children down. "I'm not here to run," he said. "I'm here to be seen." Murmurs spread through the crowd like a nervous sickness. "That woman don't belong here. Those are not our people. They'll bring trouble on us all." Elias stepped forward, positioning himself between the town and the family behind him. "No," he said calmly. "The only trouble here is fear masquerading as righteousness." He nodded toward the church. "You walk in there every Sunday to hear about mercy, about loving the stranger, about sheltering the weak. But the moment mercy stands on your doorstep with cold hands and hungry children, you call it a threat." The crowd shifted. Some eyes lowered, others hardened. Sheriff Dalton folded his arms. "This ain't scripture. This is land, community, order. And whose order is built on letting children freeze?" Elias asked. "God's or man's?" A heavy silence fell. Then from the side of the crowd, a figure stepped forward. Clara Whitman, the town's oldest widow, a woman who had lost 2 sons to war and a husband to winter. She walked slowly until she stood beside Maribel. "I know the face of grief," she said clearly. "It looks the same on every woman, no matter where she comes from." She turned and faced the others. "And if your God only loves certain colors and certain tongues, then you are worshiping the wrong one." A second woman stepped forward. Then another. They moved quietly like a tide shifting direction. Standing beside the stranger, standing beside the children. Daniel lifted his chin, trying to be brave. Lila clutched Elias's coat. "I'm not afraid anymore," she whispered. Elias looked down at her. "Neither am I." Sheriff Dalton watched the changing crowd, watched the women, watched the hesitation on the men's faces. He knew the town no longer stood united. "I won't have chaos here," he said. "Then choose peace," Elias replied. "It's standing right in front of you." A long moment passed. Finally, Dalton sighed. A tired sound. Not defeat, but realization. "Bring them inside," he muttered. "It's cold out here." The church doors opened, and for the first time in Red River history, The ones once called unwelcome stepped inside first. They sat in the front row. Sunlight filtered in through dusty windows, washing over their faces like blessing. Pastor Harlan, hands trembling slightly, began to speak. "Today," he said, voice echoing through the rafters, "we are not gathered to judge, but to remember that shelter is holy, that mercy is courage, and that sometimes salvation does not come from heaven, but from the simple act of opening a door." Outside, winter began its slow surrender. Days passed. Then weeks. The town softened slowly, warily, but honestly. Maribel found work sewing. The same hands once turned away were now sought after. Daniel attended the small schoolhouse beside the church. Lila planted flowers near the steps, laughing every time a bud dared to rise. And Elias? He breathed again. The cabin changed. Curtains replaced dust. Warm bread replaced silence. Laughter replaced ghosts. One evening, as the last snow finally melted away, Elias and Maribel stood in the field where the earth had started to bloom. Tiny white and violet flowers pushed upward, defiant and bright. "I did not plant these," Maribel said. "No," Elias replied softly. "Someone did a long time ago. For what reason?" "So they would be waiting," he said. For the moment, life decided to return. Daniel ran past them, calling out, "Mr. Crow, look what I built!" He held up a small wooden house. Strong, even, alive with joy. "You taught me that," the boy said proudly. Elias knelt beside him. "No," he answered. "You reminded me." Lila tugged on his coat. "Papa Elias, does this mean we stay forever?" He looked up at Maribel. She smiled. "This is home now," she said. "Then yes, little one," he whispered. "We stay." That night, under a sky full of unbroken stars, Elias stood on his porch again. But this time, he was not alone. There was light behind him, life behind him, family behind him. And for the first time in years, there was no cold inside his chest. He thought of the night she had knocked. The whisper, "Please." In that moment, he understood. He had not saved them. They had saved him. And sometimes, the greatest miracle does not come riding in with glory and thunder. Sometimes it knocks quietly, on a cold, forgotten door.